September 1939. The German foe begins its ruthless march of conquest and sets the stage for World War II.
We all know the story of the Second World War. It began on September 1st, 1939 and ended with the 2 atomic bombs being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in late 1945. But during this 6-year conflict, there were 8 months where nothing really happened, except for a handful of naval engagements and a brief French invasion of the Saarland. Germany was at war with France and Britain, but the two parts simply sat there and looked at each other. From October 1939 to April 1940, no armies battled against each other, no panzers penetrated front lines, and no fighters fought. Nothing really happened. It became known as the Phoney War for the British and the Sitzkrieg for the Germans. So much anticipation for Hitler's aggression and so little war. But how could this be? How could 3 of the largest military nations in the world be at war with each other, but simply sit there so passively? Nazi Germany had slowly annexed land in Europe throughout the 1930s, first marching their army into the Rhineland area that had become demilitarized due to the Treaty of Versailles. From that point, Hitler's aggressive foreign policy had become apparent to the democratic nations of France and Britain. And in the face of this, 2 ways of handling the situation arose in Britain. One led by Winston Churchill, the former politician who had been ousted from the seats of power, but who had warned of the dangers of Nazism and its aggressive policy throughout the 1930s. And another part led by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who advocated for an appeasement policy that would for all costs avoid another great European war. Chamberlain saw the ideas of Churchill as dangerous and fought to keep him out of influence, in part to also not anger Adolf Hitler and Germany. In addition, the wounds of the First World War had not yet healed in the 1930s. The end of the Great War had come just 2 centuries prior, and most of the prominent figures of the 1930s still had a fresh memory of the horrors that plagued the war. This was indeed the spirit of the pre-war period, and the first period of 1940 in Britain. Chamberlain and most of the British politicians desperately wanted to prevent another devastating war on the European continent. The situation was not much different on the other side of the English Channel. If any country could speak of the horrors of the First World War, it was France. The Republic had lost around 4.5% of its population because of the war, compared to the British 2%. Furthermore, much of the fighting of the Western Front had taken place in France, and it was apparent that this would be true if Germany would once again be the aggressor. It wouldn't be much of an exaggeration to say that the French were distrustful of the Germans. And in anticipation for German aggression, the French had begun plans for a great defensive strategy at the end of the Great War. This would be the Maginot Line, a series of fortifications along the French and German border, and in the public eye, an impregnable line that would defend France in the case of any form of aggression. It was, as well as a military achievement, also a state of mind that promised safety for the French people. In addition, a precursor for the Great War had been the large arms and navy race that had existed between the German powers, and so, to prevent a similar situation, the French and British avoided a large military build-up. Unfortunately, when the war finally came, the Germans were years ahead of the Allies' mobilization efforts. The Allies had also expected Soviet help in the case of a German invasion of Poland, but with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty, this hope had died. 4:45 p.m. September 1st, 1939, 1.5 million German soldiers invaded the nation of Poland. This was not a completely unexpected move, as the German Führer, Adolf Hitler, had continuously sent territorial demands to the nation of Poland. In expectation for this, the Allied nations of the French Republic and the United Kingdom had guaranteed Poland's independence in the case of German military aggression. And so the anticipated aggression had come. The Germans had done what had been expected, but no expeditionary forces were sent to their allies in need. No planes, no vehicles, no helmets, nothing. It turns out that the British never actually developed a plan to aid the Polish, and it took the Nazis a mere 36 days to defeat the abandoned Poles. And so, the war came, and France and Britain stood against the Germans. They, instead of dropping bombs, chose to drop leaflets, as to not provocate the Germans. The hope of avoiding the war was still there, but as we know, the Germans had entirely different plans. While the Allies desperately tried to avoid the war behind their defensive lines, the Germans planned their next offensive in France.